I'm here today to present the results of a project focusing on nonlinear PSC pathways and credential accumulation in Canada. So this project stems from the realization in the literature that post-secondary education pathways, so PSC pathways, are increasingly complex. So there's a literature documenting this, focusing on PSC access, such as delayed access to PSC, focusing on persistence in PSC, and other types of or other dimensions of PSC pathways, so, including, for example, student transfers, that is, the transfer from one program of study to another without completing the first program. For example, those leaving a college program to go attend a bachelor's program without completing their college program in the first place. It includes interruptions and other dimensions of PSC pathways. So this literature also tends to focus on labor market outcomes associated with those different PSC pathway dynamics. But there are some knowledge gaps left in this literature. So the first one is that there is a relatively limited focus on credential accumulation pathways. Credential accumulation is the accumulation or the completion of more than one credential. It can be in a linear way, so a bachelor's degree followed by a graduate degree, but it can also be non-linear, such as bachelor graduates completing a college certificate after graduating, or graduates from apprenticeship programs obtaining a second apprenticeship or trades certificate after their first one. One of the shortcomings of that literature is also the use of data with short observation periods post-graduation, and also sometimes the focus on specific subpopulations. And so for that reason, we have relatively little information on long-term PSC and labor market outcomes related to PSC pathways, especially among older individuals, but also older students. So the objective for this presentation, or for this project more broadly, was to present a statistical portrait of different PSC credential accumulation pathways in Canada, to document the drivers of different PSC credential accumulation pathways, and also to evaluate the employment and labor market outcomes associated with those pathways. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the first and third point. So where does credential accumulation fit within the broader PSC literature? So it doesn't quite, so the human capital and status attainment literatures in economics and sociology respectively don't really provide a framework to understand credential accumulation, because education in this case is often measured in terms of years of education, or by focusing on the highest credential ever obtained. The social stratification literature in sociology does focus on education transitions, but the focus tends to be on linear sequences, so upward mobility through PSC, for example, the probability of attending undergraduate education conditional on high school graduation, or studies focusing on access to graduate school among bachelor graduates. So in the literature on non-conventional PSC pathways that does exist in parallel, as I said, it focuses relatively rarely on credential accumulation, and beyond that, even when it does, graduate degrees, but also trade, vocational, or apprenticeship program certificates are not always included in the analysis and in the analysis of credential accumulation pathways and patterns. So this is another important limitation. Now, if we want to focus on the expected outcomes of nonlinear credential accumulation especially, the literature provides a few different explanations, or a few different explanations for what we may expect to see. So if we want to follow a more traditional perspective, we would expect that PSC credentials are an economic resource, so either because they provide human capital or skills, or a sheepskin effect, and so just accumulating any type of credential, even in a non-linear or non-traditional way, would be associated with an income premium. That's maybe a relatively naive explanation, though. Credential accumulation may likewise be required to enter certain professions, especially it may be non-linear, such as in the case of completing a teacher's college certificate after completing a bachelor's program, as many do. Another hypothesis or explanation that's often mobilized in this literature is the technical specialization hypothesis that argues that certain fields of study, especially at the bachelor's level, do not adequately prepare graduates for the labor market. And so here often authors will think about humanities, for example, and argue that graduates from those fields of study often complete or accumulate credentials to compensate for that, either by completing a graduate degree or, for example, a college degree after completing a bachelor's degree, and often a college degree that would be more vocationally oriented or would lead to a specific profession. But here what we would expect to find is that net of field of study, so within field of study, we would expect to see a premium for credential accumulation, including nonlinear credential accumulation. And likewise, the employability hypothesis focuses follows a similar logic, but focuses on the changing skill demand on the labor market in the context of, for example, a fast-paced knowledge economy. And so here the focus is more on lifelong learning, reskilling, and upskilling throughout the career. And we would expect that credential accumulation carries a premium, but especially in this case, I think it's likely that we would find this pattern holding field of study constant again. And now the last possible explanation is a bit less straightforward. It focuses on credential accumulation as a process where decisions may be delayed or changed, so there may be a bifurcation that may be driven by a change in aspirations and objectives, and that may be a reaction to, for example, increased familiarity with PSC, so a college graduate deciding that realizing that in the end they may be a good fit for a bachelor program, even though they didn't initially think so, and they would go on and complete a bachelor's degree after completing a college certificate. So it's not clear what this signals to employers, though. We may expect an income premium, especially if those two programs are stackable and complementary, but we may also expect that this more complex, less standard PSC pathway may carry a negative signal for employers. This may be also problematic, as I said, especially if, or as I alluded to, if the credentials that are accumulated are kind of the result of a bifurcation, a career change, and so the credentials that are accumulated or stacked are not exactly complementary and do not necessarily build on each other, leading to an accumulation of skill, but rather are associated with a career change, and where some of the content of the source of employment income premium of the first credential may just become redundant. Now, we explore those dynamics by using data from the longitudinal and international study of adults. In Wave 3, we use a special module on post-secondary education history that asks detailed information about the first 4 PSC credentials ever completed. We restrict our sample to respondents aged 35 to 59, so they're born in 1956 to 1980 birth cohorts. This allows enough time before 35 years old for respondents to accumulate credentials. We exclude immigrants who arrived after 15 years old or who spent much of their early adult life outside of Canada. That yields an analytic sample of approximately 4,000 respondents with at least one PSC credential in 2016. Now, for the results. So here I'm reporting just credential accumulation without focusing on specific pathways at different ages. So this is the cumulative share at different ages of individuals with 1 or 2 or more PSC credentials. And we see that by 21 years old, 25% of Canadians had accumulated 1 PSC credential. And that number doubled by 25 years old and then kept increasing, reaching 60% at 34. In the cohorts that are not censored, that are not censored at 34, so the older cohorts, the proportion keeps increasing. So even for the first credential, a large proportion of Canadians, at least 10% graduate from their first PSC program after the age of 25. So this is even more true for the second credential. So the other bars focus on the second credential. At 25 years old, 11% of Canadians had one, and that doubled by 34 years old. So at 25 years old, this represents about 20% of all PSC graduates. And at 34 years old, this represents more than 1/3 of all PSC graduates. Now, focusing on the actual pathways. So here, I report the proportion of individuals who obtain a credential at a second credential at a given level among those who obtained a first credential either below the bachelor's level or at the bachelor's level or more. So below the bachelor's level includes the college graduates, but also those who graduated from technical CEGEP programs, from apprenticeships, trades, and vocational programs. So here, the first piece of information that stands out is that if you see complete, it means that these are those who completed their first credential and did not pursue further education after that. 70% of those with a first credential below the bachelor's level did not persist further than their first credential. That proportion is below 50% for bachelor graduates. And this difference seems to be driven by the high rate of participation and completion of graduate school among bachelor graduates. Now, for those who completed a credential below the bachelor's level as their first credential, a high proportion of them accumulated a second credential at the same level, so we can talk about horizontal credential accumulation here, and especially for trade, vocational, and apprenticeship graduates, but also for college graduates, that accumulation tends to happen within those more detailed categories. So it's very horizontal here. Only a small proportion of those who started below the bachelor's level end up actually obtaining a bachelor's degree. We can see also some reverse credential accumulation among bachelor graduates. So bachelor graduates who go on to obtain, for example, a college certificate, 11% of all bachelor's graduates follow that pathway. Now we want to look at the labor market outcomes associated with those different pathways that we've just described. So here we're going to regress the log of annual employment income in 2015 on our variable, 7 categories variable for PSC pathways, and a set of controls that are listed here. So socio-demographic controls, some other dimensions of PSC pathways, as well as employment participation in 2015 and years of labor force experience. So these are the estimates here listed with the reference category being individuals who completed a first credential below the bachelor's level. So all other pathways that involve a bachelor's degree have a fairly large and statistically significant employment income premium relative to that reference category. The only category that doesn't see any premium is horizontal accumulation below the bachelor's level, where the coefficient is small and definitely not statistically significant. Now, if you want to unpack, all the other pathways, as I said, involve a bachelor's degree, but they're very different. So the largest coefficient is bachelor graduates who went on to also obtain a graduate degree. So the difference here is also statistically significant with those who only completed a bachelor's degree. You also see a fairly large premium for those who obtain 2 bachelor's degree, but the difference with those who obtained only 1 bachelor degree is not statistically significant here. And now the really interesting findings are that those who graduate from a bachelor's degree and then complete a second credential below the bachelor's degree experience much smaller premium compared to those who only completed a bachelor's degree without further PSC education. And that difference is also statistically significant between bachelor graduates and those who followed that bachelor to below bachelor pathway. Those who accumulated the same 2 credentials, so below bachelor to bachelor, and so this is in a different direction, so they experience premium compared to those who only graduated from a college program or another program below the bachelor's level, but they don't quite catch up to bachelor's graduate who only had 1 credential at the graduate level, at the bachelor's level. That difference is not statistically significant. It's bordering statistical significance, but it's also consistent with findings from other studies. So we can lend some credence to this finding, with the caveat in mind that the difference is not statistically significant. Now, this is not exactly consistent with the idea that any type of credential accumulation represents the accumulation of resources that are associated with income premiums, as the first hypothesis would lead to believe. Rather, this is more consistent with the other hypothesis, one of them being the technical specialization hypothesis. And here we stated that we would observe a premium for bachelor to below bachelor credential accumulation pathways, for example, within field of study. So this is what we did and controlled for field of study at the broader detailed level. And we didn't really see the gap closing all that much with bachelor graduates. So within field of study, we don't find the patterns we would expect based on the technical specialization hypothesis. But there's still a catching up with those that follow the pathway from below bachelor to bachelor, suggesting that these individuals do graduate from programs in their first credential that are more highly rewarded on the labor market. That accounts for the gap that they see with their counterparts who accumulated the same credentials but in different orders. So lastly, we looked at whether we can account for the gaps we find between individuals who follow different PSC pathways by controlling for job characteristics, so occupation, industry, supervision responsibilities, and job skill demand. And we do not find that these variables close the gap between those who follow a pathway from below bachelor to bachelor and those who follow a pathway including or basically complete a single bachelor's degree. So in other words, we're not able to account for the gap between those pathways by controlling for field of study or for observed job characteristics. That is, the difference seems to be driven by factors we're not observing the data here. So what we find is that there's a variation in labor market outcomes that seem to be driven by credential accumulation pathways. So there is evidence of cumulative inequality to the extent that we do find that completing a graduate degree is associated with the higher returns, but the road to graduate degrees is mostly closed to individuals who start off their PSC at the college level. Sequence order does matter as well. It's not taken into account in all of the studies of credential accumulation, but here we found that accumulating the same two credentials but in different orders is associated with income returns that are slightly different. So here, it's not just the accumulation of two credentials, but it's the order of accumulation that also appears to matter. Now, one of our important findings was that post-bachelor college or trade vocational and apprenticeship certificates or diploma is not associated with an earnings premium relative to other bachelor graduates. And so we concluded that this and other piece of evidence, such as the limited income premium associated with horizontal accumulation, is a sign that credential accumulation pathways are not simply equivalent to human capital accumulation or a professionalization process. But we didn't find strong support either for the technical specialization or employability hypothesis. And so that points at a greater role of a negative signal associated with delaying or bifurcations, but also issues with those credentials that are accumulated being not necessarily stackable or complementary, and so not building necessarily off of each other. One thing we haven't explored in that study is the role of selection on unobserved characteristics, such as pre-PSE factors, so funding, abilities, aspirations that may be associated with both labor market outcomes and selection into specific PSC pathways. One last thing that is the focus of the paper on which this presentation is built, but I didn't discuss so much, is that we focused on other pathways associated with low earning premiums, such as those that include specifically trade, vocational, and apprenticeship graduates, So these are sometimes ignored in the literature that tends to focus on college graduates only and not on all graduates of programs below the bachelor's level. So for future research, we could explore how transfer and credential accumulation pathways interact. Do transfer students break some of the barriers that some college graduates face in access to graduate studies, for example? Our findings are consistent with the secondary effects literature in social mobility that finds that children from less privileged backgrounds tend to enter PSC at lower levels, and this has an influence on the final level of education that they finally achieve. And so there seems to be a possible implication of our findings for our understanding of social mobility in Canada that could be investigated. And finally, this presentation highlights a need for causal research designs that may account for the unobserved characteristics of individuals who follow different pathways that may be driving the labor market outcomes associated with them. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and feedback.
So we're going to start with an introduction and an overview of social assistance programs in Ontario. So for these studies, we looked at RDC data from Stats Canada and the Ministry of Community and Social Services. Specifically, we were interested in the Ontario Disability Support Program and what some of the trends were on that program over time, including what some of the conditions that were represented on the caseload and what was happening across various regions, looking at census metropolitan areas, CMAs. We also did another study looking at the Learning, Earning, and Parenting program of Ontario Works, following two different cohorts over time. So we'll take a look into that study and then sort of conclude with implications and recommendations and next steps. So social assistance in Ontario is bifurcated into two programs. We have the Ontario Works program that I guess a workfare program specifically for, quote, able-bodied, employable people that are obviously subject to workfare requirements. So they must complete a participation agreement indicating that they will be looking for a job or volunteering or doing different activities to prove that they're aiming to find employment. As well as the Ontario Disability Support Program, ODSP, specifically for persons with disabilities. And traditionally, they've not been held to workfare expectations, although that might be changing. There's significantly more literature on Ontario Works than on ODSP, although research suggests that both programs have some significant flaws or limitations. Given the limited nature of the literature on social assistance programs and ODSP specifically, we opted to start with just providing some descriptive context to the program and how the program has changed over time. So in terms of context, roughly 1 million people, or just a little over 964,000 people were on social assistance in 2016. About 451,000 were on Ontario Works and about 475,000 on ODSP. This includes beneficiaries, so that includes the entire family unit accessing social assistance benefits, not just the applicant. This represents about 6.7% of the Ontario population, up from about 5.7% of the population a decade and a half previously. So we're starting to see, obviously, an increase in these caseloads over time. Research indicates that benefit levels are punishingly low, significantly below all the different lines of poverty in terms of poverty indicators, including the market basket measure, our national poverty line. So for a lone adult on Ontario Works, they could be expected to receive $733 a month, and for a lone adult on ODSP, $1,169. So the caseload, as I mentioned, has increased over time. We've seen almost a 27.6% increase in the caseload since 2003. And largely this growth has been in the ODSP caseload. From 2003 to 2016, ODSP grew from 280,000 people to about 475,000, an increase of a whopping 70%. So what are some of the drivers for this growth? Obviously, there's some demographic changes, at play. So an aging population, certainly lower rates of employment, less access to work-based disability benefits, as well as greater rates of diagnosis and acceptance of mental illness in society. So here you can see the rise in terms of the ODSP caseload, that straight line there going upwards, and then Ontario Works fluctuating quite a bit, but actually seeing a bit of a decline in 2016. So I must say, actually, that all of our studies that I'm talking about today were done with data taken before COVID-19. So obviously, it would be interesting to see what's going on in these caseloads post-pandemic, particularly in the context where people were, accessing the Canada Recovery Benefit or CERB. So that will be interesting to see as well in the future. In terms of, age and gender, sex on these caseloads, certainly a younger group on Ontario Works relative to ODSP, perhaps unsurprisingly, men participating at a higher rate on ODSP compared to women, and women participating more on Ontario Works during their childbearing years. In 2008 had a significant, so the Great Recession or downturn in 2008 had a significant impact on the caseloads as well, combined with, globalization, automation, the loss of manufacturing jobs, declining rates of standard employment. So that real rise of precarious work that's really hit those without transferable skills really particularly hard. We wanted to see what was happening in the caseload, ODSP caseload, across regions as well. So we ended up using the postal code conversion file available from Stats Canada to observe trends across census metropolitan areas, CMAs. And we saw a direct relationship between places that had high employment, had less people on the caseload, and conversely, places that had high unemployment. So places like Windsor, St. Catharines, Niagara, London, Peterborough had greater rates of social assistance participation. And you can see that there in terms of where these were plotted, some of the CMAs and that direct relationship with employment. In terms of what the caseload looks like, the greatest proportion of people on ODSP have a diagnosis of, quote, mental disorder, representing 56% of the caseload in 2014. And so we know that people with mental disorders continue to be overrepresented among Canada's lowest income rung. Obviously, to be on social assistance is to be living in long terms of long durations of poverty. And we know unemployment and poverty are, income are social determinants of health. Unemployment and poverty lead to stress and poor health. So that obviously increases people's time on the caseload and inhibits their exit from programs. And yet, even with this increase of the ODSP caseload, there still continues to be a group of people on Ontario Works who really should be on ODSP. But for a number of these particular barriers, haven't been able to make it on or transition onto the ODSP caseload. So there are folks that don't have diagnosed conditions, and in order to be on ODSP, you need to have a healthcare professional that will diagnose you, fill out the paperwork, and a number of them charge money to get that work done. So that cost can be a big barrier for people who have a condition and yet might not have a diagnosis. The paperwork, the application process can be quite onerous. And so for folks that might not have great levels of literacy or might have conditions that really make that completion of that kind of paperwork can be really, really difficult. So John Stapleton has sort of framed this as the welfareization of disability, where that really Ontario Works was the program, the welfare program. We're starting to see people on disability really given like a life sentence, really, of abject poverty. So this just again shows visually what we've just discussed in terms of the mental disorders. Really the greatest proportion of conditions represented on the caseload, and all the other conditions that are underneath that, just a very small proportion really relative to mental disorder. And so not only do people find it difficult to get on the ODSP program, but ODSP actually excludes quite a number of people, those specifically not disabled enough to get onto the caseload, those with temporary, sporadic, intermittent type of conditions, the kinds of conditions that might come and go, where you feel great one day and not so great the next day. I mean, you really need to have a recurrent, at least a condition that's going to last longer than a year. So that really then excludes quite a number of people that don't have those particular kind of conditions. And again, with this program, there's a hefty rule book, lots of complex rules. It's a very difficult program to navigate, and associated with a lot of burdensome paperwork. Fraser Tell basically say it's a system built on the principle of denial by design. And some work that we did a couple of years ago, basically compares ODSP in terms of its rights to privacy and self-determination, and compares that to other policy domains. And what we found was that participants are really denied the right to privacy and the right to self-determination that actually seems to be prevalent in other policy domains like education, higher education, employment, and accessibility legislation. So that was a little bit on ODSP. We're shifting a little bit now to talk about Ontario Works, and specifically a program of Ontario Works called the LEAP program, the Learning, Earning, and Parenting program of Ontario Works. And it is a program specific for teen parents. So participants on LEAP are between the ages of 16 to 21, or 25, or actually it used to be 21, and then they expanded it to 25. It's largely comprised of teen mothers. And so for those 16 and 17 years old, it's a mandatory program for them to access Ontario Works benefits. And for those between 18 to 25, it's voluntary. They can participate in the program if they would like. And it really involves three things. The learning component is really to try and encourage participants to complete high school. So that's the main focus. Earning is to try and really promote employment, particularly in the summertime and times when they are not in school. And the parenting program requires mandatory parenting classes or watching videos on, how to parent better type of thing. So we did a study looking at cohorts, two cohorts on the LEAP program, cohort 1, 2003 to 2008, and the second cohort, 2009 to 2014, and wanted to see how these cohorts fared over 5 years. How many of them stayed on the program, how many of them shifted to a different program, moved from Ontario Works to ODSP, and how many of them actually exited the program altogether. I guess not surprising for some of us, it was much easier the first cohort for them to leave. 51.3% were able to leave the program relative to 43% for cohort 2. Much more difficult for folks to leave the caseload, actually even harder for LEAP participants than it was for people in the general caseload to leave Ontario Works. So what we found was that, LEAP doesn't really appear to vastly improve the employment prospects of a significant proportion of its participants over time. Half the folks on LEAP continue to be on the program afterwards. And so we imported this program. We took Wisconsin Works, the ideas from Wisconsin Works, and made it into our Ontario Works program. And we took LEAP from Ohio. And so now some research coming up from American researchers talking about the limitations of the LEAP program in the US. And they're suggesting a shift towards a 2-generation approach where they pair early childhood education, so really promoting regulated, affordable childcare for the kids, and then for the parents, a parent human capital development approach that doesn't just focus on getting kids out of high school, but really, into long-term education and training. So making the kids are, enrolled into some really good childcare programs, and the parents are also sort of set up for better employment over time. So we sort of conclude with the fact that, Ontario, who took this program from the US to begin with, that we should consider following suit in terms of this program. So you can see here just the trajectories of cohort 1 and cohort 2, and how they have fared over time. So in terms of implications and recommendations, the inadequacy of social assistance benefits, whether it be through Ontario Works or ODSP, is certainly contributing to a lot of stress and longer-term health and mental health conditions, as we know from the social determinants of health, which is actually fueling greater social assistance participation. And as we saw from the CMA study, structural factors, right? The economic climate, whether or not, the economy is faring well, whether we have a global pandemic, whether there's, available employment that's good standard employment with benefits, or whether it's just precarious work, access to housing and childcare, that these factors actually have a greater influence on social assistance participation than that antiquated individual deficiency perspective, which suggests that people are just lazy or they lack motivation, and that's what leads to social assistance use. That's been fairly debunked in the literature, that really it's really about those structural factors that contribute to people's ability to get good jobs and stay in those jobs. And so rather than active labor market programs that have a short-term focus, so Workfare, Ontario Works right now has this focus on resume writing workshops and interviewing skills and things like that, leading to basically MIC jobs. ones that don't significantly improve individuals' prospects over time. Those minimum wage jobs, particularly where you're doing shift work, does not vastly improve people's prospects, particularly if people have to leave some of the benefits of social assistance. You know, some people get health benefits from social assistance, or you know, those shifts don't really align with daycare hours or things like that. So that focus on real short-term employment readiness is not really helpful in terms of really improving individuals' prospects over time. We're just going to see a maintenance of poverty for those folks. And so rather, access to advanced education and skills training is really what is necessary. So interventions promoting human capital development that really have that longer term focus to get advanced education, get a diploma, get a degree, some apprenticeships, that sort of thing. Pairing that with affordable childcare and housing, that those types of interventions really show more promising results. So in terms of what we're seeing now in Ontario under Doug Ford, there's a current vision to transform social assistance. The focus, however, really does draw upon that individual deficiency perspective, suggesting that, you know, people just need to become independent of government assistance, you know, that they need to get their life stabilized. So that life stabilization discourse is becoming really prevalent. Is quite flawed because, again, it negates those systemic factors. And the newest rendition of the Ontario Poverty Reduction Strategy is entirely devoted to cutting caseloads on social assistance, not doing anything to actually improve or eradicate poverty, but actually just saying people need to get off the system without actually addressing the systemic factors that contribute to the reasons why they're there in the first place. So this is a worrying trend in the face of limited government action to promote job creation and access to advanced education and training, robust housing strategies that really need to happen and need to be in place if we would like to really see those cuts to caseloads over time. So in terms of next steps, we're doing some work on intergenerational trends in social assistance use. Really the only Canadian study that has been done was done a number of years ago in the province of Quebec. We have not had any studies done in the province of Ontario looking at intergenerational trends. So largely we're looking at American literature there. So we're hoping to sort of track what's going on in terms of parents and children, and are there causal effects or are they correlational effects? What is actually going on? So we're going to try and use some event history modeling to do that work. And then also looking at the sort of leading population on the social assistance caseload right now, lone adults without dependents, without kids. So that's really the leading population. And so we want to see what's been going on with those folks over time. So that's sort of what we're working on right now. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you have questions.
Hello, and thank you for being here and listening to me about what I think is a very important policy in Ontario that was instituted a while back. And that policy was about moving from a half-day kindergarten to a full-day kindergarten. So as you may know, full-day kindergarten has been gaining ground as of late in Canada and in the US. Actually, it started gaining ground in the US from the early 70s. Now, this pattern was byproduct of some really interesting research on early childhood education, and specifically the branch of research that found that investing in an early childhood education had led to a rise in future earnings, a reduction in crime, as well as other negative social outcomes. This is some of the work by Heckman and colleagues. So in the US, there was an increase of full-day kindergarten from a prevalence of 20% in the 70s to about 70% in 2010. Canada followed suit, and specifically Ontario followed suit and then made the actual full-day kindergarten universal as of 2014. Now, a couple of notes why we actually decided to write some papers about this. And the reason why we wrote a couple of papers about this is because the evidence that was put forward for full-day kindergarten or early childhood education investment was targeted policies. In Ontario, the system, the policy became universal, meaning everybody in Ontario was eligible for it, of course, as long as you have kids that are eligible for that. So the policy, the research was done on a targeted group of people rather than a universal policy. Therefore, we would not know what the effect of this universal policy in Ontario would be. The other thing is the policy in itself, although targeted at education, might have different effect on the labor market. So myself and colleague of mine started working on 2 papers that try to analyze the effect of this policy. The way we organized it was as this graph shows. We know that extending kindergarten from half day to full day will have an effect on the employment choices of people with eligible kids. Right now, we are in an election cycle, and the Liberals and the NDP are proposing a $10 a day daycare across all provinces. Now, Quebec already has subsidized $8.35 a daycare, and then non-subsidies $35 to $60. But also, the Conservatives are proposing a tax credit to help people with their daycare costs. So needless to say, all the parties have something about daycare. Now, we think that when Ontario expanded its full-day kindergarten in its half-day to a full-day kindergarten in 2014, it also acted like a daycare for 4- and 5-year-old kids. The question we asked is, how did this policy affect the intensive margin as well as the extensive margin of the labor market? And what we mean by that, like the intensive margins, like did people that were already working, did they increase their hourly hours worked? And that would be the intensive margin. Of course, on the extensive margin, if I was not working, what are the chances that I'll start working after this policy? So this is a paper that I worked with Elizabeth Dewey, Christine Neal on, and that is published in Canadian Public Policy already. Now, of course, on the other side, we asked the question of what the policy was geared for. And the question is that given the increase in educational time for junior and senior kindergarten, do we see any improvements in the outcomes of those kids? Now, how do we measure improvements? As you may know, in Ontario, there are standardized tests that happen at grade 3, grade 6, and grade 9. What we use, and those standardized tests are called the EQAO scores or EQAO tests. And most kids in Ontario end up writing these tests. Now, the way we go about this is we only use grade 3 and 6 students, and we see whether or not there's an improvement in the EQAO scores for kids that were affected by these policies. So what we want to think about is we want to think about a model that lets us have an idea of what would the kid's score be has she or he been in a half-day kindergarten right now, but they actually got to be in a full-day kindergarten. So that's the counterfactual idea. So this is a paper under work still with Phil Leonard and Christine Neal. Okay, so how are we going to do this? When we were writing the paper, and even now, not enough time has passed to actually figure out the effect of the policy on the performance of the students. So this is especially the actual EQAO scores. So we could not directly analyze Ontario's policy. However, when we started looking at this, we realized that something similar happened in Ontario back in the 90s. Now, to talk about this, I would just like to talk about Ontario's educational system. In terms of schooling, the geography of Ontario is divided into areas that are controlled by boards. Each area in Ontario can have 4 boards: an English board, sorry, we have an English language schooling system and a French language schooling system. Each of those schooling systems has either a public board or a Catholic board. So in Ontario, we have 31 public English speaking board, 29 Catholic English, 4 public French, and 8 Catholic French. So back in the actual early 90s, the French language board started moving from half-day to full-day kindergarten, while the English board stuck to half-day kindergarten. So the idea is to use this change in order to predict the outcome of the universal full-day kindergarten policy in Ontario. So how do we do this? We do this via this, we rely on a statistical approach or method called difference in differences. Now, ideally, this method is used to somewhat replicate a controlled study experiment where we have a control group and a treatment group. And of course, as we know, the control group has to be as similar as possible to the treatment group in order for this to work. Now, broadly speaking, we use the English-speaking population together with the French-speaking population that are not affected by the policy in Ontario as where we draw a sample of control from, and the French-speaking population that is affected by the policy to draw the sample of the treatment from. And the idea is to estimate a counterfactual where we predict what would have happened to a treated unit in the absence of the treatment and compare that counterfactual to what really happened. In its most simple form, this kind of strategy takes the difference in the outcomes of the treated units from before and after the treatment, then takes the difference in the outcomes of the controlled units from before and after the treatment, and now takes the difference between those two things. So this is like the idea in here is that if I have a policy, the vertical blue line, I have a pre-intervention data and a post-intervention data. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to estimate the dotted line, whereby that would be the actual counterfactual, and the difference between that counterfactual and what actually happened would be the effect of the policy. Now, we use the census data to link variables between the EQAO scores and the labor participation. And in order for us to do this, we need to figure out the timeline of these policies. So here's a slide whereby we see that when did the French boards go into full-day kindergarten. Some of the French boards had a staggered introduction. So for example, a Grand Rivière, like in the senior kindergarten started in 94, 95, but junior kindergarten started in 2000, 2001, 2002, versus like Centre Sud from this, off the bat, they started in 98, 99, they went to full day kindergarten for both actual junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten. So this is going to give us some variation between these boards, and it's going to give us some variation. For example, people that live in Grand Rivière are going to be introduced to senior kindergarten before the Centre Est de l'Ontario, but because they actually got introduced 2000 and 2001. So people were living in this area in Centre Ontario would be like a control group for Grand Riviere if we want to. Okay, now in order to for us to figure out the effect of the policy, we need to figure out as well the actual control group, which means we have to rely on the strict eligibility criterion to enroll in a French language school in Ontario. And these are the criterion that French should be either is their first language and they still understand it. They were educated primarily in French in Canada, or the child has previously been educated in French in Canada, or by application to the school board, which typically requires at least one parent and the child have a reasonable knowledge of French. So technically, all it means is that an English-speaking household cannot easily enroll their kids in a French language school. Now, for the observed outcomes for the actual EQAO scores, it is easy because we have the test scores of the kids when they took the actual test. So therefore, we know whether you belong to a French school or not. However, in the labor paper, because we do not have the links from tests to parents, we do not know whether or not the parents that we're seeing are, or we don't have data on the parents and their labor participation or the labor outcomes before and after these policies in Ontario. So here what we do is we rely on the eligibility enrollment in French schools. So what we actually say is that we have about 4 options that we can have. We can consider a French school eligible as a family in which any child is reported to have French as a mother tongue. However, this might have some bias as parents may take advantage because it's cheaper now. I can, instead of paying for daycare, I can put my kid in full day kindergarten to switch to a French language school. So if a household has both parents employed but decides to switch to a French school to save money on daycare fees, they will be added to our treated group and therefore overstates our result. Now, the second option is to identify as French school eligible as a family in which any adult member reports that the family uses French at home. This will have similar problem as the one we spoke about before. A third option is to identify a parent as having a child eligible for a French language education if at least one of the adults in the family reports that French is their mother tongue. But this also does the opposite because it excludes a lot of people that might be eligible to a French school because all you need is a strong enough knowledge for French school. So the last option, which what we use at a baseline, is whether any adult in the family reports knowledge in French. So we take the actual census master files, and then we look in there to see if any adult in the family reports knowledge of French, and we actually say these might form the actual treated group. Now, of course, why do I say might form the treated group? Because you need to have kids that are eligible for the full day kindergarten, which is 4 to 5 years old. So what are the results? So the results are, we know in general, girls are going to outperform boys in reading and writing, but not so much in math. We know that neighborhood with affluent parents, i.e. higher income or education, tend to perform better than low income and low education neighborhood. We do not really find any interesting effect of improvement in test scores for grade 3, and whatever effects in general that we find in grade 3 disappear by grade 6. However, what we do find is heterogeneous effect of the program on lower income and education neighborhood, and also on English as second language students. So this suggests, like previous studies, that targeted policies would have a positive effect, but universal ones cost too much for their benefits. Now, we do run some robustness checks by restricting the samples to only kids that have had 2 years of full-day kindergarten, as we might think that such a program might take time to develop and kids might not adjust well in only 1 year. When we do that, we find exactly the same results as our baseline. On the other side, with the labor paper, what we find is that the participation rate of women is highest amongst the responses, highest for single mothers. So the participation rate as the extensive margin and the hourly rate as the hourly level on the intensive margin. We find most of the action in single mother household. The highest response in this group, about 11 percentage points increase in participation. That's a huge increase. We also find that already working single mothers end up increasing their hourly work. And we find some evidence that women in two-parent household have positive response, but this response is not robust to different specification that we run. We finally find little evidence to support a positive effect on men in two-parent household, and we do not have a proper size of single men and household to conduct the analysis for. Finally, we also do have some robustness checks where we use control group as a friend school eligible parents that have older kids. So meaning we cut the sample, leave all the English speaking alone. We find the same result as before. And then we combine then all the groups together and we conduct a more robust difference in difference approach called the triple difference. But again, the results stay the same. So these two papers show that targeted policy are much more efficient than universal one. And just so to close, what is being proposed right now with the Liberals and the NDP might have a different effect on participation because the pandemic had also a heterogeneous effect on the participation of women in the workforce right now. So we might not find the same result even in the universal proposals right now. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions when the sessions start.
Thank you very much for great presentations. It was very interesting, and I myself have some questions, but I will start by saying that you can stay with us for a few minutes and ask questions. You can use the Q&A in the Zoom function to ask your questions while thinking of some questions and typing them in. I actually have one for Jean. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. I should know this. Do you know if there are similar studies that have been done looking at Quebec? Because
It is.
in Quebec, it was hard. It's probably it's around the same time we changed we started the subsidized daycare program, but kindergarten was a half day and changed to full day back in '97. So do you know if there are any studies and what would they find?
Yeah, so there's tons of studies that are done in Quebec. I mean, like part of the like if you read our paper, like we mentioned those studies. For example, Michael Baker from UFT, like he has like few papers with colleagues about that as well. They found similar results. Like it's like that kind of like it's beneficial, but that like the results are almost like, you know, for the low income as well. Like we do find them ourselves. So like it's more like that heterogeneous effect that I was talking about.
Yeah, I was also wondering, I was trying to do the math quickly, but by now these these kids that started benefiting from the program are probably you could look at the effect on high school graduation rates and potentially labor market outcomes. So that might be something interesting.
Yeah, the only thing I can say about the like graduation rate in high school or post-secondary education, like the performance or anything like that, is that because once you get to post-secondary, there's a lot of movement, right? So it's kind of like if you're French speaking in Ontario, like, did you grow up here? We're actually kind of like indirectly imputing that people have done full day kindergarten here, but somebody from, for example, Quebec will come to U of T and stuff like that. And then, so there's a lot of mingling around at that level.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is that we need better data to be able to identify who actually benefited from this and where they are
exactly
15 years in the future. Yes.
Like even in our papers, like it's also true, like we cannot identify the individuals. That's why we went to the RDC, the census. It's kind of like, and then we say that, okay, like, and that's why I spoke about the French eligibility at length in the talk, because the crux, like if I know that you're the individual and you're the parent that was in the school, that would have been very easy to ascertain and then to figure out what the effect was. But we don't know that, right? So we kind of like, what we said is like, you know, if you live in an area and you speak French and you're within 40-minute drive to the school, then we're going to count you as eligible for this French school.
Yeah. I see we have a question for Tracy. Do you see it, Tracy? Do you want me to read it out to you? I don't know if everybody sees the questions in the Q&A, if the participants see them, so I can ask it. A question for Dr. Smith-Carrier. Do you know the proportion of immigrants who access SA, social assistance, and their characteristics?
Well, good question. We are actually in the process of doing a publication on that. So it's coming out in the Canadian Journal of Disability Study. Well, I guess more specifically, I guess I'm wondering whether it's in relation to the Ontario Works program or ODSP specifically. There's a lot more of a Canadian born on the caseloads relative to immigrants. It's a much smaller caseload for immigrants. Characteristics. I have to remember everything from the publication now. If you're interested, maybe what I can suggest is I can give you a sneak peek of our publication, and it'll give you much more detail. If you want to email me directly, and I can send you a copy, and then you can have a chance to absorb all the various characteristics. That would be great.
Great. I guess I have a follow-up question. I was wondering, do we have an idea of how many people would benefit from the even low amounts that are given as benefits under those programs, but that do not, for whatever reason, have access? So either they don't ask to get the benefits, or there's other barriers. Do we know much about this population?
Yes. So it is tricky for folks that are temporary or have precarious immigration status, for example, because people that access social assistance can be banned from sponsoring relatives in the future. So it's a real deterrent, because you don't want to be in a position where you come here and you're not actually eligible or able to sponsor future relatives. So that's one huge barrier. But there are folks that are temporary on the program, so that's not completely restricted. But again, it comes with certainly with barriers.
Thank you. Well, I have all the floor, given that you guys don't have more questions, but I actually had a question for Xavier, or more a comment. I really found interesting your the dissymmetry in which degree you have first, and when you had the combination is the same, but the order mattered when you had when you went from bachelor to less, or less to a bachelor. So I found that result really interesting. I thought that, so it's just a comment. I'm gonna give, I don't know if you want to add something to this, Xavier, and then we're probably gonna have to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's an important finding, or interesting finding as well, but it leads to, I think, broader questions about the circumstances that lead individuals to accumulate that second credential. And I think in both cases, the reasons may be very dissimilar, in the context too. So in this study, we just looked at accumulation, but not whether there was a spell on the labor market before. There are a ton of different reasons, and slightly different timings for the accumulation of these credentials. And so I think that's going to be one of the important next steps here. What happens if the credential is obtained long after, or some years after entering the labor market, versus just as a next step, like in a continuous pathway in PSC. So yeah, it's something that definitely raises questions on my end as well.
Great. Well, as I see that there are no more open questions, it's going to be time to wrap up. So again, I thank you very much, the participants for being here, and also the presenters for taking time to be here with us today. I just need to add that the next session in the conference is on immigration and settlement. It is tomorrow, October 20th at 1 p.m. and there is still time to register for that session if you have done so. So on that note, thank you all, and wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Goodbye.
Bye now.